That's great. So many people letting us know where they're coming in from all over the country. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Thursdays with Friends. This is an online chat and a conversation on very current issues. The topic this week is racism and policing in America. And this program is brought to you by the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a national, nonpartisan Quaker organization that lobbies Congress for peace, justice, and environmental stewardship. I'm the show's producer, Wesley Wolf-Bear-Pinkham, and here's our chat and our chat host for Thursdays with Friends, which is FCNL General Secretary Diane Randall, and our guest, José Woss, who is the Legislative Manager for Criminal Justice and Election Integrity.
Thank you, Wesley, and welcome everyone to this Thursdays with Friends. This has been a difficult week. Our hearts are heavy. We were shaken by the killing of George Floyd, a Black man, by a white police officer. We mourn George Floyd's death. And we mourn the hundreds of deaths of African Americans who have died as a result of systemic racism that is so deeply ingrained in our society. We know that Black lives matter, and we know that Black lives are routinely disregarded and diminished because of white supremacy. So we stand with protesters throughout the country who are calling for radical social transformation. Those of us who are white must confront how our whiteness denies racism. How can we become anti-racist? Personally and within the institutions that we care about, our faith communities, our schools, our neighborhoods, our families, Congress, and FCNL. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about abuses in policing that harm Black lives. And as Wesley said, José Santos Woss, many of you know from joining previously on a Thursdays with Friends, and who you may have met before in some of his work. He's been with us for quite a while. He is a legislative manager for criminal justice and election integrity at FCNL. José also co-chairs the Interfaith Coalition on Criminal Justice. I want to just note that we are broadcasting this from Zoom. Many of you are on Zoom, but we also have a broadcast on YouTube and on Facebook Live. It is our intent to try to take questions before the end of this, which will be at 4:30. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. José, welcome.
Thank you. I want to share the message version of Luke chapter 4, verse 18. God's Spirit is in me. He's chosen me to preach the message of good news to the poor, sent me to announce pardon to prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the burdened and battered free, to announce this is God's year to act. George Floyd should be alive today, as should Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, David McAtee, and the hundreds of other Black men and women who have recently died due to police brutality and racism. I recently attended one of the DC protests. As we stood peacefully on the opposite side of a barrier blocking us from a public park, one of the organizers called out the names of the hundreds of Black women and men who have been murdered in recent years. There must have been over 10 minutes of call and response. Tatiana Jefferson, say her name. Eric Garner, say his name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Philando Castillo, say his name. And each time the organizer paused for a breath, I thought to myself, we're at the end of the list. But the truth is, we had barely acknowledged the hundreds of lives stolen. 6 years ago, Eric Garner spoke his last words, I can't breathe. Last Monday, George Floyd said the same. 6 years later, we're still fighting for justice. We're still fighting for Black people to be able to breathe and to exist in a world that has robbed us of so much. We're looking at 400 years of oppression, 400 years of mothers mourning their children's murder, of children wiping their mother's tears as Philando Castile's girlfriend's daughter did, while also whispering to her mother, "I don't want you to get shooted too." She was only 4. As a Black Latino Quaker, I live at the intersection of many identities. What we're talking about today isn't just something I'm passionate about. It's my reality. From the comfort of a couch inside of a home, nestled away from fires and pleas for justice, apathetic onlookers warn protesters to remain peaceful and to be strategic. But 400 years of peace and strategy later, we still cannot breathe. Racism feeds systems that keep Black and brown people oppressed. It's easy to become apathetic to a statement like that. It's easy to say, well, I'm not racist. I have a Black partner, friend, colleague. But racism has shapeshifted. It's not just the overt slaughtering of Black people like we saw with Ahmaud. It's also microaggressions, like comments about natural hair and the suggesting that when a Black woman emotes, she must be angry. Racism is the assumption that having a carne asada while being brown or birding while being Black is reason enough to call the cops. Black people cannot dismantle systems that we did not create alone. True allyship comes in the form of using white privilege to advocate for true liberation. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary. To cast out racism and ultimately police brutality, it'll take a multidisciplinary and varied approach to identify and root it out. Maybe you're thinking, I've prayed, now what? Or I can't get through to those in my circle who have racist views, now what? Or maybe I can't relate to the protesters, now what? Liberation won't come overnight, but if our allies commit to do the work, a better tomorrow lies ahead. A tomorrow where Black men and women can breathe. I don't have all the answers, but here are a few ideas to get started.
José, let me jump in for just a minute and just say, you've given us so much already. Just taking this issue out, to the question of what's happening on the streets in terms of police brutality, but much broader than that, because we know that systemic racism is not simply a matter of what's happening in the criminal justice system or in our policing system, but really is a matter of policies and over many years in many systems, in the healthcare system and in the education system and in all kinds of ways. We want to come back and focus on the policing system, because that's really what these protests are focused on right now. And we've seen really, I think, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Certainly here in Washington, D.C., we have seen peaceful protesters circling not just the White House, but up at the Capitol. And we've seen it in major cities all over, but we've also seen this in small towns. And it's such a pent-up desire to address racism. So I also want to just thank you for already your information about how those who are white can be allies, and what that looks like, how we can show up as allies, but also how we have to listen to wisdom that is coming from people who have had this direct experience. So let's go ahead and move on. Let me just ask, if people have questions, put them in the chat. We're going to try to get to them. But I want to ask José to turn to the question of some other examples in addition to policing where we've seen institutional racism. How are we seeing it manifested in society today?
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, just about sort of like where we're seeing the structural racism in public policies, you know, how it's showing up. You know, we've talked a little bit, I know your other work that you're doing with regard to prison reform, for example, or criminal justice reform, in addition to the policing issues.
Well, right here in our backyard in Washington, D.C., you have Black people make up about 46% of the population in Washington, D.C. They make up about 76% of the COVID cases. So we see structural racism take place in the healthcare system. There's a ban on SNAP and TANF if you have a drug felony conviction. So if you're coming out of prison and you have next to nothing and just, you might not have a support system, you can access SNAP or TANF in a number of states. So it takes the shape of policies throughout our system. In the form of elections, you see the closing of polling places in largely Black areas. In Texas, you saw the banning of student IDs as a means of registering to vote, but you can vote with a gun permit. So it takes the shape of a lot of different policies, state, local, federal. It's everywhere. It's insidious.
So let's talk about some of the federal legislation that you're tracking right now to address policing abuses. I know you have a few items and these are up on our website, but I'm wondering if you could just go through these one by one.
Sure. So we have the Eric Garner Excessive Use of Force Prevention Act of 2019. This is a bill that would make it a civil rights offense and would also make it illegal to restrict the passage of air of an airway by police. Basically, it bans a chokehold. You have the Peace Act. This is a bill that would implement a necessary standard for use of force in policing, federal and state, and it would make all other methods of engagement a requirement before an officer uses a lethal use of force. There's also the End Religious and Racial Profiling Act, or ERPA, that is exactly what it says in the name. It would end religious and racial profiling in policing. And it does this and the Peace Act both are state as well because it attaches to federal monies that goes to state law enforcement. So it's a really good piece of legislation. And it would end religious and racial profiling. Lastly, the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, which would reform the transfer of military equipment to local law enforcement, or the 1033 program. So those are some elements of federal reform that we can work on.
Thanks. And some of these are issues that have been around for a while, but have become a little bit more, that have kind of perked up, and we've seen some life to it. Can you give us any updates about where the status is, for example, on the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement issue of repealing this program that gives military equipment to local police departments?
So last week we got some really good news. Senator Schatz, his tweet stated that he would be proposing an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to end the 1033 program. And we've been hearing that there are similar there's similar actions being taken on the House side as well. So this is really exciting.
And just say what people should do if they want to get involved in this, if they want to talk to their members of Congress, their senators or their House members.
Reach out to a member of Congress, tell them that you don't think that police should be militarized. They shouldn't be acting as an occupying force in your community, and ask them to end the 1033 program, and they can do that through the National Defense Authorization Act. Everyone gets a vote on this bill.
So this is going to be, and just to be clear, that my understanding is that this particular initiative right now is going to come up as an amendment in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is that big bill that deals with most military things. So I think we're going to be sending out an action alert next week, specifically when we think the vote's coming up. Is that what people should expect?
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other thing, you know, we know that this issue, obviously people know that FCNL focuses on federal legislation. And so these initiatives that Jose is talking about are ones that everyone can participate in because you all have 2 sisters and a member of the House. Some people are asking, what's this look like at a state level or a local level? Do you have advice for just what people should be thinking about or pursuing in addition to the federal work that we hope people will all take part in?
So there are things that every law enforcement agency takes into account. They all do training. They all have use of force standards. And you can ask whether or not they take implicit bias training. You can ask whether they have de-escalation training. Also, what's the use of force standard? You can ask that. Your local law enforcement, your sheriffs, they each have standards and protocols. And if not, you can ask your state and local legislators to have this implemented. Implement implicit bias training, de-escalation tactics. And this could come from the federal government, but it works much better and faster at the local level. And you have the power to do that. At city council, your state legislators, they can implement these changes.
Yeah, it's, I mean, like so many of the issues that we work on, and I think certainly this issue in terms of the systemic aspect of how racism affects all of our lives, it will take action. In addition to the federal action, which we think is really important, it will take action at the state and local levels as well. Can you say a little bit about more, I mean, these are steps. These steps alone don't dismantle racism, but they're important ones. And just want to note that Stephen Donahoe has put a link up in the chat for the connection to the specific action you can take. Those are all available on FCNL's homepage of our website, so we hope you'll visit those. But can you just go back to these issues, Jose, and just kind of name why they're important for dismantling racism? I mean, how does this fit into the bigger picture of what our goal is?
So I always go back to the inception of police in America. From the constable force, police departments took shape to protect property mainly. And among that property were people, were enslaved people. And systemic racism has just taken different forms throughout every generation. And it's the hard work of passing policies and modifying programs and looking at your local police departments. That's how we take on structural racism, and that's why it's so important.
I noticed that one of the questions there in the chat was about the 21st Century Commission on Policing that I think the Obama administration convened and put out after Ferguson. And I do know that, you know, one of the you're involved in not only the Interfaith Roundtable that we talked about, Criminal Justice Roundtable, but you're also involved in a couple of bigger coalitions. Do you want to talk a little bit about the leadership conference and those recommendations, kind of some of who our colleagues are in Washington who are, and what they are working on and how we're working with them?
So the leadership conference letter was really strong, really powerful. We signed on to it. It had 8 different recommendations involving qualified immunity, which is a very complex legal term, to modifying standards within laws, to the 4 pieces of legislation that I mentioned previously, including other grant programs to improve policing. But it really highlighted how strongly they condemn the systems of policing in this country that have failed us by taking away so many Black bodies and just acting with impunity, because they have cooling off periods where the union can have a conversation with a law enforcement officer involved shooting, otherwise known as murder, to get their story straight. So there were a lot of different recommendations in there. Our legislative ask is similar to a number of them, but it was a really strong and powerful letter, and we work a lot in coalition with them.
Right, and they had this letter, I'm not sure if we put it up on our website, but they're one of our allies, and there are others that we're working with, including the faith community that has, of course, been we're really enheartened, I think, to see a lot of our colleagues, that have spoken out so strongly. If there are there other questions that people have that they want to ask? One, I am seeing some chats where people are making both recommendations for what they have worked on locally, as well as for their requests. I know Catherine was concerned about states sending National Guard troops to Washington, D.C., and we have seen very militarized response here in Washington of tanks and a variety of security forces that have shown up on the streets here. And I do want to say that we've also seen you've probably seen the same images of peaceful protesters throughout. Jose, earlier I jumped in when you were talking, and was there something that you wanted to offer when I interrupted you? With my apologies for doing that.
Oh, thank you. So there were a number of other recommendations that I had, and I think it starts off with educating yourselves. Listen to Black women. You've heard it said, but now is the time to truly hear what the leaders of this movement have to say. Attend a protest, which I'm sure many of you have. Suit up with your mask and stand alongside your Black brothers and sisters who have shown up on the front lines for over 10 days now, despite being shot with rubber bullets, tear gas, and threatened by our president. If you're a legal representative, sign up with the Lawyers Guild and provide support in that way. If you're high risk and cannot chance exposure to COVID-19, drop off water and snacks to your local protest rest stop and have a conversation with other white people in your life. That's one of the key ways that we dismantle structural racism in our circles around us, because it lives among us and around us. And I started this Thursday with friends with the scripture, Luke 4:18. I urge you to highlight it, bookmark it, commit it to memory. I'm still working on the memory part. But in this scripture, we're reminded that the burden is on us as believers to hold Black and brown people in the light, to alleviate poverty for the poor, to advocate for criminal justice and police reform, and most urgently to support the oppressed, because all lives can't matter until Black ones do.
Thanks, Jose. Thank you. So a couple of questions have asked two things. One, there was a person earlier who asked about dialogue with family members who are in law enforcement and how to have that conversation. Do you want to offer any suggestions on that?
So it's a difficult conversation. The first and the starting point has to be their humanity. There's someone who deals with these systems day in and day out. And I think it's key to start there, because taking it from their perspective and understanding what they're going through, I think is a good place to start. And talk about the systems, talk about how we have decades of systemic abuse and say that not every law enforcement officer is going to do this, but every single one of them is acting under color of law, and it's their responsibility to root this out because it's their community. So I think starting off there is a good place to begin.
Thanks. And I just want to add one more question. We're about out of time, but do you want to also comment on this movement we're seeing about defunding police and how you see that as a step toward addressing systemic racism?
I would say there are a lot of different priorities, and budgets are moral documents. Where you put your money is what you value. And there are a lot of things that could use our funding: school lunch programs, education, funding for community colleges, trade schools. There's a lot of things that can use funding, and states have a lot of demands on those budgets. funding prisons, jails, police departments isn't the best use of those funds. So I think we can start off by redirecting the priorities with which we fund what we care about. And that's a great place to start to how we defund police. I have a friend of mine who's a city council person, and she was talking about how she's looking at different parts of the budget to fund so she can start defunding the police. So I think that that's a great place to start.
Thanks. And that's certainly consistent with FCNL's position around how militarization has affected both our international policy as well as our domestic policy, and the need to reprioritize where we're putting resources that address human lives. And I think that's really what we're trying to do both internationally as well as domestically in this priority. I want to give you the last word here, Jose. I just want to remind people that we will look at the questions that you've put out, and if we can answer them, we will try to answer them directly with you. We didn't get to all of the responses, but I want to say that we're right now looking at opening up the Quaker Welcome Center on Capitol Hill this weekend for people who are protesting, trying to figure out how we can be able to do that safely during the pandemic. But there are a lot of churches that are responding that way, and we have some capacity to do that. So we want to be supportive of what's happening in the streets, as well as this policy work. We know that it will take policy work, and this advocacy will be extremely important to actually implement some of these recommendations. And your voices, as always, are really, really important. But Jose, any closing thoughts?
I would say that dismantling racism and white supremacy is hard work. And I appreciate what you already do to do this through policy, through our action alerts and reaching out to members of Congress. That's part of it. But there's also more, taking it apart in your circles, in your professional lives, how it creeps up with your colleagues who might be people of color, try to lift up their needs in meetings. And there's a lot of different ways that you can tackle this. And I appreciate every single one of the ways that you're doing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And I know Wesley just put in the chat that this is going to be, there's a recording of this. And so if you want to listen in, or you want to share it with if you're a Quaker, share it with your Quaker meeting or your faith community, we hope you'll do that. I do want to encourage you to go to the Action Center and act on these bills that Jose has talked about. Talk to your senators, talk to your member of Congress. And I also just want to thank people for your financial contributions to FCNL. That is how we sustain this work. And so we're very grateful for that as well. Thank you. We are continuing these sessions. We were really grateful that Jose could jump in here. We're going to come back and have Leash Cannon talk to us about COVID-19 and climate change at some point. And we're also going to be talking about our advocacy. So please stay tuned and come back every couple of weeks. And we look forward to being in contact with you. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.